So if you just stop and look at a civilization that's operating at its absolute peak,
Right.
you see the towering architecture, the concentrated wealth, the political dominance that just seemingly stretches across continents.
Oh, yeah, the whole empire aesthetic.
Exactly. And the elite class of that society is just thriving, completely insulated by their capital.
Yeah.
From the outside, that civilization looks invincible. I mean, it looks like the ultimate victory.
It's the pinnacle of human achievement,
Yeah.
supposedly.
But then you read the diagnostic text we are dissecting today for this deep dive, and you are hit with this haunting, just deeply counterintuitive label for those exact architects of power.
Al-Akasarun.
Yes, al-Akasarin,
Yeah.
which translates to the greatest losers.
It completely inverts the standard metric for success.
It really does.
We are so conditioned by history and culture to equate material accumulation with winning to the point where any other definition feels almost naive.
That was my exact reaction, honestly. My initial assumption, just based on traditional readings of ancient texts, was that the greatest losers had to be a purely theological threat.
Sure, yeah, like a cosmic punishment.
Right. The standard narrative where the people who skip the rituals or worship the wrong way end up in a literal, fiery afterlife.
Yeah.
Just thought it was a conventional divine punishment.
And to be fair, that is the conventional interpretation that has dominated for centuries.
Yeah.
However, the scholar G.A. Parwez, whose analysis of Surah Hud forms our source material today, he just discards that mystical lens entirely.
Completely throws it out.
Exactly. He approaches this text as a work of gritty, empirical sociology. When he translates Al-Akasarun, he is diagnosing the elite failures.
The elite failures. I love that term.
Right. He's looking at the people at the absolute apex of the socio-economic pyramid who possess every resource, every political lever, and immense intellect.
So they waste it.
They utterly waste it by architecting a system that is mathematically and scientifically destined to tear itself apart.
And it is vital to set the parameters for you listening before we get too deep into this. Parwez is reading this text through a heavily anti-capitalist, anti-clerical lens.
Highly political.
Very political. He is actively dismantling traditional power structures in his analysis. And whether or not you align with his specific politics or theology, his underlying framework, what he essentially calls social physics, what forces you to look at power structures and religious authority from a radically different angle.
Yeah, it's a completely new paradigm.
Right. And our goal isn't to endorse a political ideology today, but to impartially map out the sheer intellectual weight of his argument.
Which requires us to start exactly where Parwez starts, which is epistemology.
Okay, lay it out for us.
Because if you are going to claim that an entire civilization, especially a wealthy, thriving one, is fundamentally broken, you need a mechanism to prove it.
Right. You can't just say they're bad and leave it at that.
Exactly. You need a way to define what is true. And Parwez argues that the text itself does not ask the reader to take its claims on blind faith.
Which is huge.
It's massive. It actually provides a very strict three-part epistemological test to validate any system.
That stood out to me immediately.
Yeah.
Because the assumption with religious or, ancient texts is usually a demand for absolute, unquestioning submission to dogma.
Just believe it because it's written down.
Yeah, exactly. But Parwez outlines an engine of reason that relies first and foremost on scientific observation.
The first pillar.
Right. He argues that any valid system must align with human knowledge and scientific discovery. Like, if your ideology contradicts the physical realities of the universe or human biology, it fails the test outright.
It establishes reality as the baseline.
Yeah.
The text, according to Parwez, demands that as human knowledge expands, the governing system must hold up to the new data.
It has to evolve with the facts.
Exactly. But the second pillar is just as rigorous and perhaps harder to achieve, honestly.
Yeah, definitely.
It's the unbiased mind. You have to approach the truth scrubbed clean of prejudice, inherited tradition, and the dogma of your ancestors.
Which is incredibly difficult.
Yeah.
I mean, we are all products of our environment.
We all have biases.
Right. But I suppose if you come to the data already determined to prove that your grandfather's worldview was correct, you'll just manipulate the data to fit that pre-existing mold.
You'll see what you want to see.
Yeah, you become blind to the actual mechanics of the world.
And that leads directly to the third pillar, which is the pragmatic historical test.
This is my favorite one.
This is where the sociological rubber meets the road. Parwez insists that to test a system, you must look at the ruins of past civilizations.
You have to look at the receipts.
Exactly. When a society ignored the natural laws of human equity, what was the actual physical result? Did they survive, or did they disintegrate?
It makes me think of, like, testing a radically new economic policy.
Okay, yeah.
You wouldn't trust a new fiscal theory just because the politicians' speeches are eloquent, right?
Right, the speeches are just the dogma, the marketing.
Exactly, the marketing. If you want to know if the policy works, you first run the economic models to see if the math actually makes sense.
That's the scientific test.
Boom. Second, you have to look at it objectively, ignoring the fact that the policy was proposed by a political party you usually support.
The unbiased mind.
Right. And third, the pragmatic test. You look at the historical data. Like, when a country implemented this exact same policy 50 years ago, did the middle class thrive, or did the economy collapse into hyperinflation?
That captures the methodology perfectly. And Parwez is subjecting religious and socioeconomic systems to that exact same rigor.
He's not giving religion a free pass.
Not at all. He treats the text as a verifiable program. If a society follows a specific religious or economic system, and the tangible result is poverty, extreme inequality, and the enslavement of the working class,
Then the system is broken.
then that system is demonstrably false. The objective results invalidate the system, regardless of how many holy men or politicians claim it is divine or optimal.
But this brings up a massive friction point for me.
Okay, what's that?
If the truth is this verifiable, if the pragmatic historical test is so blindingly obvious that societies built on extreme inequality eventually collapse violently, how do we end up so far off track? Because we aren't talking about foolish people here. We are talking about highly educated elites, philosophers, and leaders falling for and actively enforcing completely fabricated systems.
And that is the central tragedy of human organization.
Yeah.
Parwez uses this exact contradiction to pivot into how truth is actively and purposefully manipulated by those in power.
It's not an accident.
No, it's very intentional. He explores this concept through the text's discussion of, quote, forging a lie against God.
Which usually means something very specific.
Right. Traditionally, we might think of this as a lone individual falsely claiming to be a prophet.
Some guy on a street corner shouting.
Exactly. But Parwez identifies a far more insidious systemic danger, which is the established religious and intellectual class.
The people who already control the cultural narrative.
Yes, the gatekeepers. And the specific mechanism they use to manipulate the truth is captured in the Arabic term Iwaja. Yes, which translates to crookedness or deviation.
Okay, let's trace the mechanics of this Iwaj. Because a blatant lie is easy to spot. Like, if a leader stands up and says the sky is neon green, the population rejects it.
Instantly.
Right. So how does this crookedness actually function in practice without triggering an immediate revolt?
It functions through subtlety. Parwez argues that the laws of nature, the universal principles of human equity, are inherently simple and straight.
They make sense.
They dictate balance and fairness, and they don't require complex, esoteric rituals to understand.
You don't need a PhD to get it.
Exactly. But the religious and cultural establishment introduces Iwaja into these simple laws. They introduce a microscopic deviation from the straight path.
And the motive is entirely economic, isn't it?
Always.
I mean, if the path to truth and equity is straightforward and accessible to the common person, there is no need for a specialized gatekeeper. A society doesn't need to pay a massive tithe to a clerical class if the people can understand the laws of social physics themselves.
The religious establishment needs a monopoly.
Yep.
By introducing complex rituals, esoteric interpretations, and positioning themselves as the sole intermediaries capable of understanding the divine will, they make themselves indispensable.
They insert themselves as the middleman.
Exactly. They secure wealth, power, and high social status without ever having to contribute productive labor to the society.
You don't farm, they don't build.
Right. They simply manage the Iwaj.
The analogy Parwez uses for this in the source text is it's one of the most illuminating concepts I've ever come across.
The train track.
The train track, yes. So he compares it to a train running on a track. The straight track represents those natural, equitable laws of society.
Okay.
Now, if the gatekeepers want to hijack the train, they don't construct a totally new, obviously crooked track right next to the train station.
Because people would know.
Exactly. If they did that, the passengers would see the destination is wrong and just refuse to board.
The deception has to be practically invisible at the point of origin.
Right. So instead, they operate the switch track. They introduce a deviation of a fraction of an inch, the Iwaj.
A tiny shift.
And at first, The train appears to be heading in the exact same direction. The scenery out the window hasn't changed. The religious gatekeepers use the exact same vocabulary.
That's the insidious part.
Yeah, they use words like justice, faith, and divine will. The architecture of the temples remains the same. The rituals look identical to the naked eye.
But the angle is slightly off.
Exactly. Because of that fraction of an inch deviation at the source, if you give that train a few centuries of travel, the society ends up in a completely different paradigm.
They're miles off course.
The passengers believe they were traveling toward equity, but the destination they arrive at is total exploitation and control by the elite class.
And the most devastating consequence of this deviated track is the psychological conditioning it inflicts on the population over those centuries. Oh, wow.
Yeah.
The text refers to this when it describes people who lose the capacity to hear or see the truth. Parwez interprets this as a profound religious prejudice.
Because they don't know any different.
Exactly. Once a population is born onto this deviated train, generation after generation, the Iwaja becomes their absolute reality.
They lose their analytical senses entirely. They fail the first two pillars of proof we talked about, the scientific observation and the unbiased mind, because their mind has been permanently molded by the deviated track.
Functionally, they become blind. And Parwez points out a very specific behavioral marker of this condition.
What's that?
When someone challenges this deviated system with logic or historical evidence, the conditioned population does not respond with rational counterarguments.
They don't debate it.
No. They respond with absolute visceral rage.
Ah, that is so true.
They resort to violence, they refuse to listen, they attempt to destroy the critic. This aggressive reaction is the ultimate proof that they lack any logical footing.
Because if you have logic, you just use the logic.
Right. They cannot defend their position with the engine of reason, so they defend it with raw emotion and violence.
This circles back to the elites, though, the ones actually managing the switch track.
Okay.
I'm looking at this from a purely pragmatic standpoint. If these gatekeepers and the wealthy class are on the wrong track, if they're fundamentally misaligned with the laws of nature, why do they look so dominant?
Ah, the illusion of success.
Yeah. Because if you examine a corrupt billionaire or an elite cleric who's manipulated the system for decades, their bank accounts are expanding.
Sure.
They own vast estates. They wield massive political influence. Their bodies are well fed. They have access to the best health care.
They look like they're winning.
From every visible metric in our society, they are the ultimate winners. So where exactly is the loss that justifies calling them al-Aksaran, the greatest losers?
That contradiction is the core of this sociological diagnosis. The elites themselves genuinely believe that they have bypassed the laws of nature.
They think the rules don't apply to them.
Exactly. They look at their amassed capital and their political dominance, and they conclude that the consequences of exploitation simply do not apply to them. They believe they have engineered an escape hatch from societal collapse.
They think wealth provides immunity to social physics.
Yes. But Parwez dismantles this illusion by drawing a sharp, fundamental distinction between biological existence and what he terms the human personality, the self, or the nafs.
The nas.
Yes. This distinction is crucial to understanding their failure.
I really want to dig deep into that distinction. How does Parwez separate the biological from the psychological here?
So our physical, biological existence is something we share entirely with the animal kingdom.
Right.
We seek calories, we seek physical security, we gather resources to protect ourselves from the elements.
Basic survival.
Exactly. And the elite class is undeniably successful at this animalistic level of existence. Parwez uses a rather biting comparison here.
What's the comparison?
He likens them to a prized, well-fed show horse. Yeah, you can put a horse in a gilded stable, feed it the most nutrient-rich diet, groom it obsessively, and protect it from any physical hardship.
Sure, it's going to look great.
It will look magnificent. Its biology is thriving, but it remains fundamentally an animal.
So the elites are feeding the animalistic instinct to hoard resources, but they are starving something else.
They are starving the human personality, the nafs.
Ah.
The nafs is the capacity for higher reasoning, empathy, a sense of justice, and the ability to integrate oneself into the broader collective human struggle.
The things that make us human.
Right. While their physical bodies and bank accounts are expanding, their inner selves are experiencing profound decay.
And Parwez points out something absolutely fascinating about this concept in the text.
Yeah.
He notes that it took modern clinical psychology, I mean, think of the frameworks developed in the 20th century by people like Jung or modern developmental psychologists.
Right, modern science.
It took centuries for them to fully articulate the concept of an integrated personality versus a disintegrated personality.
Which is exactly what Parwez is talking about.
Exactly. An integrated personality is balanced. It processes reality accurately, it forms meaningful, equitable connections with others, and it grows stronger through pro-social behavior.
It's healthy.
Yes, but a disintegrated personality is fragmented. It's entirely consumed by an insatiable ego, driven by paranoia, and ultimately self-destructive because it cannot relate to the world outside of its own consumption.
And Parwez's argument is that this ancient text outlined the exact mechanics of this psychological disintegration 1,400 years ago.
It's wild to think about.
It is. The elites are Saroon, the greatest losers, not because a lightning bolt is going to strike them from the sky, but because their inner self is completely disintegrated.
They hollowed themselves out.
They have traded their unique human potential for shiny objects.
That just reframes the entire concepts of wealth and consequence. Like, they think their capital is a fortress.
They do.
They think they can build a society based on crushing the working class, and as long as they live in a gated community, the social rot won't touch them.
It is the pinnacle of arrogance. Parwez asserts that societal laws, the laws of equity and balance, are just as immutable as the laws of chemistry or gravity.
You can't cheat gravity.
Exactly. You cannot ingest poison and simply talk your way out of the biological consequences regardless of your net worth.
You can't bribe your own cellular biology.
Right. And similarly, a ruling class cannot build an entire civilization on the systemic exploitation of the masses and somehow avoid the eventual mathematical collapse of that system.
The math always catches up.
The social physics will inevitably catch up. The structural integrity will fail. They are the greatest losers because they sacrificed their own psychological integration and doomed their society to violent collapse in exchange for a temporary, fragile luxury that was always destined to turn to dust.
Okay, so if the elite's path of endless accumulation and exploitation mathematically guarantees a disintegrated personality and a collapsed society, we have to look at the alternative. Yes. What is the mechanism for achieving this integration? Because identifying the disease is only half the battle. We need the actual treatment protocol.
Well, the protocol is outlined through 3 interconnected concepts in the text.
Okay.
They are Amanu, Amilu Asalihat, and Akbatu.
Now, I know from my own background reading that these terms are usually flattened into very passive, ritualistic translations.
Very much so.
Belief, good deeds, and submission. He usually paints a picture of someone sitting quietly in a place of worship, dropping a few coins in a charity box, and just keeping their head down.
Which is exactly the Iwaja, the crookedness that Parwez is trying to scrub away.
He's fixing the track.
He's fixing the track. He applies his sociological lens to restore the original active power of these concepts. For Parwez, Amanu is not blind, inherited belief.
Okay.
It is a state of deep, reasoned conviction. It is the conclusion you reach only after applying the engine of reason, the scientific, objective, and historical tests.
You have to do the work.
You don't just believe the system, you have verified its structural integrity.
It's the difference between believing an airplane will fly because a priest told you it would, versus having conviction that it will fly because you actually understand the aerodynamics of lift and drag.
A perfect distinction, yes.
Okay, and the next one.
Building on that conviction, we have Amili As-Salihat, which translates traditionally to good deeds.
The charity box.
Right. But Parwez defines it as constructive, balancing actions. It's not just giving a hungry person a piece of bread, though that is a kind act.
It's not a bad thing.
It's not. But it is the active, systemic work required to fix the structural inequalities that cause the person to be starving in the first place.
Oh, wow. So it's systemic change.
Exactly. It is creating proportion and equity in the economic and social fabric.
And that leads us to the ultimate pivot point, which is Akbatu.
Akbatu.
The traditional image of Akbatu is entirely physical. The act of physically bowing down, lowering your body to the ground in a posture of submission.
But the conceptual reality is far more radical. Akbatu means bowing your intellect, your ego, and your entire societal structure strictly to the universal equitable laws of nature.
Yep.
In this framework, those laws are synonymous with the laws of God.
I need to pause here because the political ramifications of that definition are staggering.
They really are.
Think about the mechanics of power. If Akbatu means submitting only to the universal laws of absolute equity and justice, that inherently means you are actively refusing to submit to anything or anyone else.
It is an absolute rejection of human-imposed hierarchy.
Exactly. If a population of 1 million workers stands up and declares, "We bow to no one but the ultimate law of equity," they are not just engaging in a private spiritual exercise.
No, it's a strike.
They are issuing a direct existential threat to the ruling class. They are declaring, "We refuse to bow to human tyrants. We refuse to bow to imperial kings. And we refuse to bow to the capitalists who hoard the wealth we create."
It's a revolution.
Bowing to God, when understood without the Iwaja, is an act of supreme political rebellion. It is the ultimate strike against systemic oppression.
And this is exactly why the established elites are terrified of true Akbatu.
Because it targets their wallet?
It completely delegitimizes their power structure. If no human being has the right to subjugate another, the elite's entire economic model of exploitation collapses.
The whole system falls apart.
Parwez highlights an analogy in the text that contrasts these two opposing groups, those on the deviated track and those practicing true Akbatu.
Is this the analogy of the blind versus the seeing?
Yes. The elite system produces a populace that is willfully blind and deaf to the reality of their trajectory.
They just ignore the warning signs?
They ignore the historical ruins of past empires. They ignore the pressure building in their own working class.
Right.
But the aligned system, the path of Akbatu, produces people who operate with total clarity. They observe the road signs of history, they understand the immutable math of social physics, and they take proactive, balancing actions to build a sustainable society before the collapse happens.
It's a brilliant theoretical framework. I mean, we've established the epistemology, the mechanics of crookedness, the psychological decay of the elites, and the political rebellion of true submission.
It's all there.
But theory is fragile without application. It's one thing to chart out the physics of societal collapse on a chalkboard. It's another entirely to see it actually happen.
Which is precisely why the text pivots from theory to a brutal historical case study.
To prove it works.
To prove that this social math plays out in reality. And it does this by introducing the story of Prophet Nuh or Noah.
I have to admit, this is where the source material completely derailed my preconceptions.
How so?
Because my cultural programming regarding Noah is basically a children's book.
The Ark and the Animals.
Exactly. I picture a very old man with a flowing white beard gathering 2 giraffes and 2 lions onto a wooden boat, preaching to his neighbors about a literal meteorological rainstorm while they just point and laugh at him. It's mythology.
Parwez shatters that mythological framework.
Completely.
In this sociological reading, Nuh is not a quaint, passive preacher warning about weather patterns. He is introduced as a highly organized social revolutionary.
A revolutionary.
Yes. The text identifies his role with the specific term Nadhirim Mubin, which translates to a clear warning.
Okay.
But the impending doom he is warning about isn't a magical act of nature. He is warning about the inevitable consequence of their specific socio-economic structure.
Because the society was deeply stratified. So Nuh is looking at the extreme wealth hoarding at the top and the crushing poverty at the bottom, and he's basically calculating the pressure.
He is diagnosing a social flood.
A social
flood is the violent, chaotic, and often bloody collapse of a civilization that has stretched the bonds of inequality past the breaking point.
When the rubber band snaps.
Exactly. When the oppression becomes unbearable, the societal dam shatters, and the resulting chaos washes away the entire structure, elites and commoners alike. Nuh's mission is an attempt to dismantle the explosive elements of the society before that breaking point is reached.
So he's a revolutionary organizer doing the math. He's standing in the public square saying, the structural integrity of our economy is failing. If we don't redistribute the weight, the whole thing comes down.
And his primary directive to the masses, his core organizing principle, is explicitly stated in the text.
What is it?
Do not serve or submit to anyone except God.
Which ties perfectly back to our breakdown of Akbatu.
Exactly.
It sounds like a theological prayer, but it's actually an economic demand. Nuh is speaking directly to the working class, the laborers, the people building the civilization, and he's telling them to withdraw their consent.
Stop participating.
He's telling them to stop participating in their own subjugation. He's demanding they stop acting as disposable cogs in the elite's wealth-generating machine.
It is the ultimate labor strike. He is telling them that their obedience to the elite is a violation of the natural laws of equity.
But let's look at the logistics of power here. You don't just walk into a highly militarized, deeply stratified ancient society, tell the working class to stop bowing to the bosses, and expect the ruling class to politely step down.
No, they don't surrender easily.
Right. The elites control the military, the food supply, the cultural narrative. How does the establishment respond when Nil starts organizing the masses?
They respond with a predictable, profound arrogance. The text introduces the opposition using the term mala.
The mala. Now, Parwez uses a very evocative cultural idiom from Punjabi to describe them, doesn't he? Something about grain bins.
Yes, he describes them as the class whose bins are full of grain.
Bins are full of grain.
It perfectly encapsulates their material reality. The mala are the monopolists.
The 1%.
The 1%. They are the capitalists, the massive landowners, the political elite whose literal and metaphorical silos are overflowing with hoarded resources, while the laborers who harvested that grain are left to starve.
They're the ones operating the switch track.
They are the direct beneficiaries of the Iwaja, the deviated track, and their rejection of Nu is instantaneous.
But the reason they reject him is what I find so revealing.
Why is that?
Because they don't engage with his argument. They don't bring out their own economists to debate his social physics. They don't try to prove that their extreme wealth hoarding is actually sustainable.
They don't need to debate the logic because they attack his demographics.
Right.
The text highlights the sheer elitist disgust of the mala. When they look at Nu's movement, they don't see aristocratic scholars or wealthy merchants.
No.
They look at the crowd and they see the carpenters, the blacksmiths, the weavers, the shoemakers. They see the manual laborers. The elite class considers the absolute lowest, most despicable tier of human existence.
The arrogance here is just staggering. I mean, the elite's counter-argument is essentially, listen, Noah, if your message was actually profound, if it was the actual truth, we, the wealthy, educated thought leaders of society, would have realized it first.
We are the visionaries.
Yeah, we are the visionaries. The mere fact that your movement is entirely composed of street sweepers and factory workers is proof that your ideology is worthless garbage.
They conflate their hoarded capital with intellectual and moral supremacy. They believe their wealth is proof of their advanced capacity for truth.
But the logic is incredibly fragile. Let's apply the first pillar, the scientific test, to their argument.
Let's do it.
A fundamental law of physics, say gravity or thermodynamics, is true regardless of who discovers it or speaks it.
Absolutely.
If a king sits on a golden throne and declares a new law of gravity, and a street sweeper drops an apple in an alleyway, the apple falls at the exact same rate.
The math doesn't change.
The truth of the universe does not care about your tax bracket or your social status. The laws of social physics, the reality that systemic inequality leads to collapse, are objectively true. In fact, it makes perfect logical sense that the people being physically crushed by the failing system are the absolute first to recognize that the system needs to be dismantled.
The person starving knows the food system is broken long before the person with full grain bins realizes it.
Exactly.
That is the blind spot of the elite, and Parwez emphasizes that this dynamic isn't isolated to the story of Nu.
It's a historical pattern.
This is the blueprint of systemic class warfare throughout all of human history. Whether you are looking at the pharaohs of ancient Egypt, the rigid caste systems of ancient India, or modern hyper-capitalist structures, the methodology of the elite is identical.
Keep the people down.
They purposefully structure society to keep the lower classes economically dependent, uneducated, and politically disenfranchised. The text uses a specific term for these marginalized masses, the mustadafun.
Mustadafun, meaning those who are rendered weak. And it's an active process.
Very active.
They aren't inherently weak. They are purposefully kept weak by the structure of the society.
Exactly. The power of the mala requires the weakness of the mustadafun.
One feeds the other.
So, when Nu, a revolutionary organizer, arrives and declares that the illiterate manual laborer possesses the exact same human personality, the exact same nafs and dignity as the wealthiest landowner, he is threatening to shatter the elite's entire worldview.
It's an existential threat.
If they admit that the laborer is fundamentally their equal under the laws of nature, then their hoarding of the society's wealth becomes morally and scientifically unjustifiable.
They can't accept his logic without destroying their own supremacy. They have to reject him entirely out of raw economic self-interest, but they dress it up as intellectual superiority.
And that very refusal to adapt, that stubborn clinging to their artificial hierarchy and their grain bins, is precisely what seals their fate.
They seal their own doom.
Their arrogance blinds them to the societal pressure cooker. They refuse the treatment, guaranteeing they will be swept away when the social flood inevitably breaks the dam. Their wealth cannot buy them a way out of the math.
The pieces of Parwez's diagnostic puzzle fit together so seamlessly here. I mean, we started by looking at a supposedly successful civilization and uncovering the elite failures, the greatest losers who trade their psychological integration and their society's future for short-term luxury.
Right.
We traced the mechanics of Iwaja, how religious gatekeepers subtly bend the tracks to extract wealth while blinding the population to reality.
The subtle deviation.
We explored the physics of a disintegrating personality trapped inside a thriving biological animal.
The well-fed horse.
And we watched Nu step onto the historical stage, not as a passive preacher, but as a mathematically precise revolutionary organizer, delivering a clear warning of the coming social flood, only to be rejected by an elite class blinded by their own hoarded grain.
It is a profound framework. Parwez gives us a lens that demands we look past the surface-level metrics of success, the stock markets, the architecture, the sheer accumulation of capital, and examine the deeply hidden structural foundations of a society.
It makes you question everything.
It is an invitation to constantly verify the tracks we are riding on.
And if you think the tension between Nous and the elite class peaks, with them simply turning up their noses at the working class, you need to prepare for the next layer of this history.
It gets even more intense.
Because as we look ahead to the next section of the source material, verses 28 through 37, Nu is actively organizing this revolution of the laborers, but he makes a shocking strategic declaration to the elites.
Okay, what does he tell them?
He tells the Mala, "I do not ask you for your wealth, and I do not claim to possess the magical treasures of God."
Oh, wow. Which leaves us with a critical, lingering question regarding the logistics of revolution.
Right.
If Nu flatly refuses to take the elite's hoarded money, and he explicitly admits that he doesn't have magical wealth raining down from the sky to support his movement, how exactly does a revolutionary actually fund the physical building of an entirely new, equitable society?
How do you build the new world when the oppressive elites currently control all the grain bins of the old one? It forces you to completely rethink the true nature of human capital. It makes you analyze the mechanics of solidarity, and it highlights the sheer, unstoppable economic power of the working class when they finally decide to pool their own resources and labor.
It's a huge cliffhanger.
It is. Keep that exact logistical puzzle in your mind before you dive into the next text. Until next time, keep exploring the deep end.